grand research. Lieutenant Henry Clark was 41, a Eurasian, and a member of the Indian Subordinate Medical Service. His wife, Louisa, was 6 years older and also perhaps Eurasian. She too had a medical background, inasmuch as she'd been a nurse at the Calcutta Medical College Hospital before their marriage. By 1909, the Clarks had 4 children, but their marriage was an unhappy one, and they had heated rows, particularly over Clark's repeated affairs and flirtations. Of the other couple, the Fulhams, both were apparently Europeans, though born in India. Edward Fulham was 43 in 1909, his wife Augusta 8 years younger. He worked for the military accounts department in Beirut as a deputy examiner. His wife Augusta, described in one recent populist version of these murders as a tubby temptress, was the daughter of a Calcutta river pilot. She was as vain as her husband was lascivious, as Clark was lascivious. One account described her as a society woman fond of social festivities and gaieties. The Fulhams had 3 children. Harry Clark and Augusta Fulham began a passionate affair, and despite his being transferred to Delhi and then to Agra, he continued to visit Augusta in Beirut. He had had a string of previous affairs and sexual encounters, including with those whom Augusta referred to as black hens, meaning Indian prostitutes in the bazaar. But Mrs. Fulham began rather optimistically to anticipate the happy life they would have together once her hubby, as she habitually referred to him in her intimate letters to Clark, once her hubby had been removed from the scene. Their thoughts inevitably turned to poison. Later it was claimed that this was simply in order to incapacitate Mr. Fulham and force his retirement to somewhere else in India or Britain, but the real intention was always to kill him. Attempts to dispose of Louisa Clark in the same way, by poison, administered by one of the Clark's Indian household servants, met with no success. The arsenic they used made her vomit, and therefore she ingested very little of it. And so she was pronounced by the disappointed lovers to be poison-proof. It seems extraordinary that she remained with Clark, despite knowing not only of his affair with Augusta, but also their systematic attempts to poison her. But she seemed determined to retain the sham of respectability in their marriage, rather than to divorce him, at least until their younger son was old enough for them to live apart. Harry and Augusta had more success with her hubby. Clark knew very little professionally about poisoning, though he knew enough to use abortion-inducing drugs, and indeed had used this knowledge to help Mrs. Fulham at an earlier stage. But it was easy enough to read up about poisons and drugs, particularly in such standard works as Lloyd's textbook of medical jurisprudence for India, which Clark duly consulted, rather self-incriminatingly underlying particular passages and turning down the corner of key pages. As a doctor, he had easy access to arsenic, to atropine, and other poisons, and during the summer of 1911, he sent Augusta little packets of poison through the post, which she slipped into her husband's tea or mixed with his synatogen. They called this his heat stroke mixture. The idea was to induce the symptoms of heat stroke. However, the effects were not all as they desired. Small doses of arsenic turned Fulham's complexion, as she put it, a lovely pink, and left him at first feeling full of life and vigour. Indeed, he chased around the kitchen table. Arsenic was widely believed to increase sexual desire, one reason why it was a common aphrodisiac in India, with the result that he became inappropriately amorous towards his wife and would-be killer. Eventually, however, arsenic and a cocktail of other drugs produced the intended effect of apparent heat stroke and apoplexy. And following a final fatal injection delivered by Clark at the bungalow in Agra, they'd all moved to Agra by the stage, Edward Fulham died in October 1911. A scene, as if to emphasise the domestic intimacy of this murder, witnessed by the Fulham's 11-year-old daughter, Kathleen. Clark then pronounced his lover's husband dead and signed the death certificate. Without further inquiry, Fulham was buried in the Cantonment Cemetery at Agra. His grave is still there. And Clark was then free to spend time with Augusta until their adulterous relationship became common knowledge. It is likely that Myrtle Fulham, otherwise known as Carrots, born in 1910, was in fact Clark's child. But there was still the poison-proof Louisa to dispose of. On the 17th of November 1912, 4 Budmashes staged a fake burglary at the Clark's house. Louisa, struck on the head with a sword, died the following day, but it now became evident that Fulham's death a year earlier had been suspicious. A police inspector sent to investigate Louisa's death stumbled across a dispatch box belonging to Clark but under Augusta's bed in the Fulham's bungalow. It contained 400 passionate and highly incriminating letters from Augusta to Clark and revealed in great detail how they intended to murder their respective spouses. Fulham's body was exhumed, chemical tests showed traces of arsenic, and the well-preserved state of his viscera further suggested arsenic poisoning. In the first of the 2 widely reported trials that followed at Allahabad High Courts in early 1913, Kathleen Fulham, aged 10, testified to Clark's involvement in her father's death and by implication her mother's complicity. And Clark himself confessed to the murders in a last-ditch attempt to save Augusta from execution. The second of these trials involved the Indians involved in the murder of Louisa. Although the precise cause of Eddie Fulham's death could not be ascertained, the incriminating letters, backed by Clark's own confession, convinced the jury of his and Augusta's guilt. Clark was executed shortly after, in March 1913, but Augusta was spared the death penalty because she was again pregnant by Clark. The child, born in Naini Jail, which is where Jawaharlal Nehru was later incarcerated in 1913, was then removed to an orphanage. By what some considered poetic justice, Augusta then died of heat stroke, the very cause of death they tried to attribute to the husband, in May of 1914. So that's my basic story. Now, in some respects, the Agra murders and the trial that followed were unique. For more than 30 years afterwards, commentators, both European and Indian, wallowed in this Eastern story of passion, murder, and intrigue, calling it one of the most extraordinary and diabolical murders ever encountered. All India rang with the horror of it, wrote Francis Pearson in 1935, and the whole of India was convulsed by the trial. Slight exaggeration, still. But this was not an entirely isolated or unrepresentative episode. Europeans and Eurasians tried from time to time to poison each other, and the Fulham Clark murders even inspired 1 or 2 alleged copycat murders. But the larger issue for me to be drawn out of these murders, quite apart from their timing, 1911, of course, was the year of the Imperial Durbar, the high point of empire. All these murders take place within the shadow of the Taj Mahal, that emblem of romantic love. Much more interesting, perhaps, is what they say about intimacy and its connection with poisons. And I think there's something to be said here about the way in which historians of colonial India, I include myself in this, have ignored the question of intimacy. Intimacy has always been dealt with at 1 or 2 removes. There's certainly a lot of writing about sex, about prostitution, and similar issues in colonial India, but it seems to me remarkably little has been written and thought about the question of intimacy itself. So this is in part an essay about intimacy. The Agra double murder case unlocks a whole series of interrelated intimacies. The sexual intimacies, most obviously, between Harry Clark and Augusta Fulham, domestic intimacies of home and the family, captured for me by Kathleen Clark testifying to her mother's own trial, the recurrent intimacies of food and drink, I'll come back to the water later, and the Indian servants called upon knowingly or unwittingly to administer them, the intimacies of race, Indian servants and hired assassins, murdering Europeans, and of Europeans, Eurasians and Indians living together, conspiring together, in apparent innocence of any racial apartheid, and perhaps most strikingly, the serial intimacies of Harry Clark himself, the doctor who was also an abortionist, the adulterer who tries to poison his lover's husband, the man who is also a white murderer. The Agra case suggests something of the reverberations, the reverberating complexities of intimacy in a colonial setting. Beyond that, the kinds of unconventional intimate relations that the Clark-Fulham murders reveal were by no means confined to the white population, but have many parallels and extensions in poison murders and attempted murders among the Indian population. So I don't see this as a racially restricted episode. So let me give you two further examples. One of these was the lengthy investigation into the murder in 1894 of Jagannath Chatterjee, a 60-year-old Brahmin moneylender in a village close to Calcutta, whose death was at first attributed to strangling by a man called Sharma Charan Pal, who was said to be the intimate friend of the victim. So the victim, Chatterjee, was said to have been poisoned and then strangled after an altercation between these two men over property. But the trial suggested, it was never proved, a much more likely cause. Jagannath's young wife, Mati Devi, was 35, and 10 years earlier she'd rather unconventionally taken herself off on a pilgrimage to Puri and come back with a young lover, a man from Orissa called Pandu Barak. And he became her de facto lover, a low-caste man from Orissa living in this Brahmin household. He was supposed to be a servant, but the word rapidly got out that he wasn't just that. Jagannath and his wife no longer ate or slept together, and indeed the servant's wife was singularly close to that of the woman of the household. And the liaison between these two became increasingly common knowledge. So much so that the local Brahmin community began to ostracize Jagannath and no longer allowed him to use the hookah reserved for Brahmins in the local tea shop. But it seemed as though Jagannath was just about beginning to act on this relationship and to expel his wife from the household when the murder occurred. Now, it's a complicated case. The actuality of it was never fully discussed. There are all kinds of village and caste politics bound up with this. But even though the police investigation was badly botched, or perhaps deliberately subverted, chemical analysis showed that Jagannath died from morphine poisoning and not from strangling, as originally suggested. But this could not be conclusively proved, in part because it was not uncommon for Brahmins in this area to be addicted to morphine. Let me add one further case. This occurs in a Zamindari family in 1932, again in Bengal. I'm not victimising Bengalis in this discussion. This was a case of two half-brothers, one of whom, Banoyendra Nath Pandey, tried twice to kill his half-brother, Amendra Pandey. The first time by using the poison, here we come to the whole question of what we mean by poisoning, but a degree of poison in the form of tetanus in the pince nez, which was forced onto his half-brother's nose, which thereby gave him a not fatal but severe dose of tetanus. However, the half-brother recovered, so the perpetrator and his doctor friend went off to Bombay, to the Hafkin Institute in Bombay, and eventually, after a great deal of trouble and duplicity, acquired a sample of the plague bacillus. And this time they used, I think, an umbrella or some other means by which to inject the unfortunate half-brother, and this eventually succeeded in killing him. Now, what's interesting in this case and many others is the degree of publicity which these cases acquire. All three of these cases I've cited, including the Fulham Clark case I began with, appear, for example, in S.C. Sarkar's volume of Notable Indian Trials, first published in 1948 and in its third edition by 1962. His rationale was that the public loves to read sensational murder cases and to watch the great dramas of life played out on the stage of the criminal courts. But he might have added that the exposure of other people's intimacies always has a kind of vicarious appeal to the public readership. But let me extend this discussion of Indian intimacies and their poisonous connections a little further. As that last case illustrates, or second case illustrates, the Jagannath Chatterjee case, one of the commonest instances of the murderous use of poisons in India was in relation to loveless marriages, when a young wife, egged on or aided by her lover, used arsenic or other domestically available substances like opium, powder glass, or datura, to dispose of her older and unloved husband. The usual vehicle for this was the food the wife prepared for her husband. And this was only detected either by the husband's alarm at finding something unpalatable in his meal, or after death had been reported by a chemical analysis of his stomach and other bodily parts. One alternative for an unhappy wife was, of course, suicide, and many poison cases involving opium in particular relate to this. Another extensive use of poisons was taken orally or inserted into the uterus to effect an abortion and to conceal the consequences of an extramarital or transcaste relationship. Given the toxic nature of the vegetable and mineral substances used, the consequence of this was often the death of the mother as well as the unborn child. And of course, Ranajit Guha wrote about this to some extent in Chandra's Death, an essay which reminds us that these intimacies tell us about subaltern histories as well as about histories of intimacy. There are other instances in the poison literature of the period that speak to what one might think of as unexpected or unconventional intimacies. Not just those of the household or the village, which we might expect, but, for example, those of the road. As what the British defined as thuggee was suppressed or passed into apparent decline in the mid-19th century, so official attention shifted to what some police officers saw as the almost equally heinous crime of dacoity by poisoning. And this is a story I'll come back to when I talk about the state side of this in a moment. So in such cases, a traveller, sometimes disguised as a sadhu or a fakir, meets up with a party of travellers, and over the course of a day or two he gains their confidence. He cooks a meal for them or offers them food in the form of sweets or prasad, which has been laced usually with the vegetable drug datura. The intention being not to kill them, but to stupefy and incapacitate them for long enough to enable the trickster to rob them and then disappear from the scene of the crime without anyone being in a position to pursue them. In some cases, the victims were peasants returning from market with the profits of their sales, or cart drivers who then lost their cart and bullocks as a result of their misplaced and ill-judged trust. Such crimes were apparently fairly widespread in the late 19th century, and indeed there are dozens of these histories which emerge from the official accounts. But it is perhaps surprising, at least from a conventional reading of caste relations and intercaste taboos, that travellers were quite so willing to share food and drink with complete strangers. There are other intimacies too which I would want to bring into the story. Intimacies which were perhaps less explicitly sexual than those I began with, but relates to other aspects of the corporeal. Investigation into the sale and distribution of arsenic in 19th century India revealed a great array of the uses to which that substance was put. It was used in tanning leather, in the kind of paint applied to toys, and in the colouring of sweets. But it was also used more intimately for removing unwanted hair and for whitening skin, uses which, however commonplace, it was very hard ever to criminalise. Even prisoners in Indian jails used arsenic in paper making without much apparent concern that it might, as one person said, lead to mischief in the hands of any designing or vindictive prisoner. Despite its wide usages, actually very little arsenic was available in India itself. Most of it was imported, and indeed there was a very substantial increase in the importation of arsenic into India in the second half of the 19th century, from about 100 tonnes in the 1870s to about 500 tonnes 20 years later. So actually the British were facilitating this increased importation of arsenic into India in this period. Arsenic was among many other substances, vegetable and mineral, that were used as medicines and as aphrodisiacs, or perhaps as we now might think of them as fertility drugs, in the belief that they would encourage the production of semen and lead to the creation of children. But of course, in many cases, they actually resulted in physical injury and death. And indeed, it is by these harmful, often unintended effects that we can trace the wider social as well as criminal uses of arsenic, and so gain a rather different history of Indian intimacies and of the social history of poisoning in this period. So the first half of my paper is really about the way in which we can use poison to construct certain kinds of intimate histories, and the way in which, in a sense, poison is very central to the reconstruction of what those intimate histories might be about. The second half of my paper is about state stories, and I'm trying to make a contrast here between histories and stories. Poison does more than inform us about the intimate histories of those who used it. It also helps us think about the kinds of stories the state, or indeed its agents, told about itself, tales of insecurity and danger, of science and superstition, of enlightened progress and thwarted ambition. One could call these state stories histories too, but what I'm trying to contest in a sense is the idea that these are simply authoritative truth claims, and to look beyond that to see their identity and function much more in terms of the way in which collectively they become narrative fictions that serve to dramatise and legitimise the power of the state, or which were deployed to caution us about the practical limits and ideological frustrations of the colonial regime. To some extent, these stories, these state stories, overlap with the histories of intimacy I've already tried to present. And it should be clear to you that, in a sense, I'm using the same sources to present these two different kinds of historical episodes and narratives. I'm trying to see politicization as the process by which intimate histories were transformed and aggregated into a more general tale in the hands of the state and its agencies. And also trying to look at the production thereby of an argument about the state or about the state of society that sought to shape the activities of the state, its policies and its attitudes. So within this context there was first of all the story of poison and poisoning as a perceived threat to the personnel of the colonial state, to its security and its superior form of politics. Poisoning of this kind relates to what Megan Vaughan, in writing about Mauritius in the 19th century, refers to as the betrayal of intimacy. Such were the instances of poisoning or suspected poisoning in which aggrieved Indian servants who had been mistreated and physically and verbally abused by their masters, or Indian servants who'd been dismissed, turned on their employers and sought some kind of revenge through the administration of poison. So, for example, there's one case cited in which a butler was employed by a particularly bad-tempered and abusive European official in some part of North India, and the official threw a jug of hot milk in the face of this servant, causing him considerable pain and scalding his face. In revenge, the servant put ground glass in his master's favourite dish, a meringue of guava, but this was detected by the official's wife, who had been alerted to this by one of her maids. A European fear of treacherous Indian servants was clearly exacerbated by the Indian Mutiny Rebellion of 1857, in which the defection of loyal household servants was one important and traumatic episode in the part of the European participants in those events. But these cases shade into a more generalised concern about the way in which careless rather than malevolent Indian servants allow Europeans' food to be contaminated with poison, or who, like Indian ayahs, were suspected of using opium to keep their Indian babies' charges content and docile. Some colonial texts, like Moore's Manual of Family Medicine, betray accidental poisoning as part of the perennial European problem of how to manage Indian servants. So poisoning is very much there as part of the almost daily discourse of European existence in India. But more alarming from a European perspective was the use of poison as a means of assassination. That poisoning could be almost routinely used as a political device in India had long been established in British minds, and by the early 19th century, poisoning formed one of the stock images of the depraved and barbaric nature of Indian princely rule. And you only have to turn to that classic work, James Todd's Annals of Rajasthan, to see countless instances in which Indian princes, in that case Rajputs, are constantly poisoning each other. But in a way, the British accepted this practice because, however unprincipled in their eyes, this did not threaten them directly, or at least mostly it didn't. However, sometimes it did. The most notorious example of this concerned the Gaekwar of Baroda in 1874, who was deeply antagonistic to his political agent, Colonel Fair. Suspecting that the Gaekwar may have owed his own accession to the throne to the poisoning of his elder brother, Fair saw the Gaekwar as vicious, despotic, and mentally unstable, and made that the secret of his determination to dethrone this Indian prince. One morning, as he was taking his daily drink of sherbet and pomelo juice, Fair noticed that it tasted rather bitter and had a rather gritty residue. Subsequent chemical analysis revealed the presence of arsenic and also ground diamonds. A bit of a giveaway to have ground diamonds in a poison. Not everyone can afford to use ground diamonds in that way. However, the drink had been prepared by Fair's own servants, so once again we're brought back to the problem of the intimacy of the servant and master, and the Gaekwar's involvement could not be conclusively proved. Perhaps he intended anyway only to scare the resident rather than to kill him, or perhaps Fair, whose own mental state was increasingly unhinged, had contrived the poison himself in order to throw blame onto his adversary. Fair was removed to another posting, and the Gaekwar, after a special commission had investigated his conduct, was duly deposed. But the net effect of the Baroda poisoning case was to give fresh substance to the story of the barbaric nature of Indian court intrigue and princely diplomacy, while underscoring afresh fears for the vulnerability of British officials. The politicisation process associated with poison went well beyond this. Aside from immediate political threats that the poisoning of people like this might constitute to political agents, there was a widespread belief in the criminal uses of poisoning in India in ways which appear to threaten the security and authority of colonial rule. And in this narrative, in this state story, the twin evils of poison and thuggee are closely entwined. Now, in the early literature about what the British describe as thuggee in the early 19th century, the emphasis is all upon strangling and the dismemberment of the travellers who are dealt with in this way. And there are very few references to thuggee as involving poisoning. But as poisoning in that conventional sense declines by the 1850s, there is the invention of something like thuggee through a discourse of poisoning. And the key individual here is the man who becomes the superintendent of the thuggee and dacoit department in the 1850s, a man called Charles Hervey, who in a sense almost invents a story about the new menace of poisoning by the drug datura of travellers across a large part of northern India. And he draws the attention of the government to this as an urgent threat to the authority of the government and to the security of the Indian population. So he starts talking about what he calls datura thuggee. Now what's interesting here for me is the methodology that Hervey employs. To a large extent what he's doing is assembling the kinds of intimate histories that I talked about earlier. He has dozens and dozens of these brief vignettes in which travellers are waylaid, deceived, and ultimately poisoned, sometimes murdered, by these fake fakirs and disguised poisoners. So in a sense, he's using intimate histories for a rather different purpose than any of those individual travellers would ever have used this kind of narrative. So he begins to impress upon the government of the northwestern provinces what he describes, and they describe, as a crime most dangerous to society and opprobrious to our rule. It's a threat to our rule as well as dangerous to society. And this idea of dacoity through poisoning, this revived form of thuggee, is a very powerful discourse persisting into the 1910s and 1920s. Only very gradually does it fade out of us. Now, not everyone believes Hervey's inflated story, and maybe will suspect him of trying to invent a panic to serve his own career interests. He himself is able to produce very little evidence that this crime is actually taking place. He looks at the whole of British India for 3 years in the 1860s. He can only find 416 possible cases. But despite the slenderness of his evidence, this alleged crime of poisoning as part of dacoity becomes a very prominent part of the medical and legal and criminal discourse of late 19th century British India. And the most striking of this is the Bengali-based physician Norman Cheevers, who gives a detailed account of what he calls the widespread crime of datura poisoning in his very influential account, pioneer account, of medical jurisprudence in India, first published in 1854 and then republished several times thereafter. Cheevers identifies thuggee by poisoning as not only a danger to lives and property, but also, as he says, as indicative of the criminal characteristics of the people of India and their great moral defects. Such poisoning, he claims, was typical of a timid people, of a race more accustomed to duplicity and treachery, the very hallmarks of thuggee, than to open violence in its criminal activity. Like Hervey before him, Cheevers did not seem to be hampered by the apparent lack of evidence, and wrote, "It is only by thoroughly knowing the people, and by fixing the mind sedulously upon the record of their crimes, that a European can learn how strange a combination of sensuality, jealousy, wild and ineradicable superstition, absolute untruthfulness, and ruthless disregard for the value of human life lie below the placid, civil, timid, forbearing exterior of the native of India." A fairly sweeping condemnation. And it's interesting the way in which datura, which is written up in the early 19th century as a relatively innocuous drug, and perhaps even medicinally useful, becomes demonized so that it becomes some kind of terrible substance which might lead to permanent incapacity, mental delusions, and possibly death. Let me refer to, once again, the Fulham Clark murders in order to elaborate one of the other kinds of state stories I'm trying to get at here. It's interesting if one looks at the account of these murders written by Sir Cecil Walsh, a former High Court judge in India in the 1920s. And in his account of the Agra double murder, he gives particular prominence to race, almost to the extent that race becomes the real poison in his narrative, explaining attitude and motivation in a way that chemical analysis and forensic investigation seem unable to do. Hence, in his account, Louisa Clark is described as coming from a good, though humble, Anglo-Indian family. Eddie Fulham is similarly described as almost pure English. By contrast, Augusta Fulham is seen as having betrayed not so much her intimacy with her husband as her racial superiority as a pure white woman, firstly by falling for the lustful and duplicitous Clark, and then by conspiring with him to murder her husband. Worst of all, in this racialized narrative, Harry Clark is tainted by being of pronounced Eurasian stock, with his dark skin and apparently shifty appearance. And this racial trait appears in Walsh's story to explain his willingness to commit crimes ranging from illegal abortions to arsenic poisoning. Walsh went on to explain that since Clark was born in India and lived there all his life, he must have been aware of the common confusion between the symptoms of arsenic poisoning and those of cholera, and there was widespread uncertainty about whether people had died of cholera or of arsenic. And so, according to Walsh's story, he must have felt confident of his ability to get away with this murder. Walsh further observes that Eastern ideas and Eastern thought play a large part in the makeup of such a man. It is even possible that he inherited from his Hindu ancestry the belief, curious to Occidental notions, that murder by poisoning is a less heinous crime than murder by the shedding of blood. And yet there was actually very little that was racially overt about the Fulham Clark murders, or even, to a large extent, the trials that followed. In fact, the story of the Fulhams and the Clarks often seems to obscure issues of race. Augusta Fulham appears to have had no racial qualms about her liaison with Clark, the Anglo-Indian, or been particularly offended, except from jealousy, by his relations with the black hens in the Indian bazaar. There seem to be so many points of contact and overlap between Europeans, Eurasians, and Indians. The children of both families go to the same European and Eurasian schools, anticipate similar employment in government service. Clark, like Fulham's own father, belongs to the racially constituted Indian subordinate medical service, and yet he shares murderous confidences not just with Augusta, but with an Indian Christian clerk called Joseph. And he seems to have had no qualms about employing Indian badmashes to murder his wife. Indian servants weave in and out of the story, as they do in so many other tales of murder in India. Race may be elusive, but it's not entirely absent. Indeed, it seems to form an incidental part of much of the intimacy that the Fulham Clark case entails. In one of her letters to Harry Clark, Augusta tells of how she's sitting outside in the moonlight after a dinner party, and somebody suggests that she takes off her white silk gloves. And she says, "Why not wearing white gloves? It's my white skin." And there is frequent reiteration in her writings to Harry Clark of the advantages of having a fair complexion and the implicit contrast between her complexion and his dark skin. Now, I could go on to illustrate other accounts of poisoning and their significance for this evolution of state stories in the second half of the 19th century. For instance, there's a lot of discussion in the late 19th century about the deliberate poisoning of cattle in many parts of India, a crime which is attributed to Chamars, the argument being that the Chamars have an interest in getting hold of the skins of these cattle and then selling them on to hide merchants and making a profit as a result of that. Now, this is very much, I think, a state story, in as much as it ties in with one representation of Chamars in this period as being a semi-criminal community. And indeed, some Chamars were indeed being brought under the provisions of the Criminal Trials Act in this period. I don't see it as a history of intimacy, unless one burrowed very deeply in that story and thought about untouchability and the questions of intimacy which it entails for high castes and for others. So there are a whole series of poisoning narratives emerging from the state sector or within the state sector in the series, some of which build upon those stories of intimacy I described, some of which seem to come from another direction. There's also a set of stories about the nature of indigenous medicine and indigenous drugs involved in this as well. And again, a lot of this revolves around specific drugs, particularly vegetable drugs like datura and aconitum, which are fairly readily available in the Indian bazaars or indeed on waste ground in the case of datura. And the argument here developing from early in the 19th century is that these are not suitable for medicinal purposes. They are, by their nature, highly dangerous drugs, and that therefore the medical practitioners, the Indian medical practitioners who employ them, are implicitly engaging in a very dangerous practice by employing them. This becomes bound up with a particular state narrative, or at least attempts to create a particular line of state policy. So, for example, in 1843, Frederick Mowat, who was the chemical examiner to the government of Bengal, called for an investigation into dangerous drugs and their criminal uses. He counted at least 36 such drugs, which he held were widely available in the bazaars of Indian towns and cities. And in a language not unlike that employed later on by Hervey in talking about datura thuggy, Mowat argues that this is a cause of public concern and, as he puts it, a matter of very great importance to the state. In a short term, little was done to outlaw these supposedly dangerous drugs, and yet medical poisons continue to fuel the narrative impression of suspicion and danger surrounding indigenous therapeutics and the practitioners who administer them. And that goes into a much more detailed story about the condemnation of Indian medical practice and the virtual criminalisation of certain kinds of drugs widely used in Indian medical practice. Now, there's a coda to this discussion, which is really about the state response to poison and poisoning, and I'll just briefly try to summarise that point of my argument. There was, in the case of Britain, widespread scares about poisoning in the 1820s and the 1830s. And the arsenic panic of the 1840s in Britain gave rise to legislation greatly restricting the availability of arsenic and a whole series of measures which tried to limit the sale and the conditions of sale of arsenic and other dangerous drugs. That doesn't happen in India in any substantial way until 1904, so 60 years later. So my question is partly why it is that despite the circulation of the stories I've described, there wasn't more immediate action on the part of the authorities in India to suppress these kinds of things. The answer to that question is quite a complicated one. One is that to some extent the British government in India was wedded to a policy of laissez-faire, of inertia. If it acted against arsenic as a criminal substance, it was in danger of affecting the wide commercial uses of arsenic, and that was something which was contrary to the British policy. But I also make the argument, I suppose, that the state was actually quite happy for there to be, as it were, these soft stories about the dangers of Indian criminality, of Indian drugs, rather than being committed, as it were, to a hard policy in which it tried to pursue active measures to suppress or regulate these kinds of practices. And there is a constant argument that actually trying to intervene against arsenic in particular would be much more difficult than in the British case, partly because those intimate stories that I suggested earlier would run counter to this. How do you stop people from using arsenic as a way of removing unwanted hair? How do you prevent all the various kinds of uses that arsenic has on a very everyday basis across a wide slew of Indian society? Moreover, arsenic doesn't appear to be a direct threat to Europeans for most of the time, although there is one case in 1895 in which one pair of European lovers do actually poison her spouse with arsenic, and that particular poison case in 1895, rather than the Agra murders in 1911-1912, does actually spark serious government concern about the need to regulate the arsenic trade. So it's only through a combination of factors, that murder, the growing concern over the use of arsenic to poison cattle, the growing concern about the unregulated use of arsenic in indigenous medicine, the ready availability of arsenic and other poisons in the marketplace, all of these cumulatively push the government of India to act, and after 10 years deliberation, eventually to introduce a rather imperfect piece of legislation in 1904. So my argument, in a sense, is that it's not that the government of India lacked information. It did have a wide amount of information about poisoning, in as much as knowledge about poisoning is ever complete and full, but it saw more reasons not to act than it did to intervene. And therefore, these stories are the important part of this account, rather than any hard state policy which was deployed against poisoning. So basically, that's my argument, to try to draw a contrast between intimate histories and state stories, to talk about poisoning as something which potentially opens up for us a much wider history of intimacy than we currently have for India in this period, and to see poisoning as presenting a complex layering of narrative which says a lot about the nature of power, about race and society in the colonial context. Thank you.
Thank you, David. That obviously gives a lot to think about. And I'm probably going to ask you something which is, I guess, more as an anthropologist than as a historian or someone who knows a little bit of that history of intimacies. So I was wondering if you think of intimacy as something that is not necessarily about joining, but something that is actually separating. So i.e. there are intimates, and it's about separating out people you cannot be intimate with.
Yes.
And so that's what intimacy does, is actually lays down a boundary. And what poison does is contaminate that boundary, i.e. it becomes a conduit for disturbing that separation. And whereas, so therefore its potency for telling intimate histories is therefore of a different order than poisoning, which is about, say, cattle poisoning, or even actually in the case, so if you think of intimacy and the Clark case in the first, so it is about keeping deception from truth separate, keeping the two, deception and truth separate. In the case of Tuggy, deception is the truth of the act. So there is no need to keep those separate in some way. So therefore, it's not a conduit; it is the thing itself. Mm-hmm. And cattle poisoning, as and I was trying to wonder what are the. So therefore, it looks like it's at a remove. It's a much further remove, and therefore it probably has, or is something that does not lend itself to that kind of potency as it does in intimate situations. So there's transgression is not really deception. Transgression is not really as part of a complex. You can't construct a story in that sense around that basic transgression.
Yeah. Because in many cases that I'm describing, the transgression precedes the poisoning by a long way.
That's
so
right.
in a sense, the poison is almost the aftermath of the transgression.
That's right.
Or the consolidation of the transgression, if you like.
That's right.
The question of cattle poisoning is interesting, and I need to think about this more, because it can be written up simply as a story of what happens in the countryside and the way in which these Tremars are, if you like, a suspect group anyway. It's interesting to me because my larger story, as I suggested at the outset, is about wider questions of pollution, which does get me into all kinds of anthropological minefields. And of course, many untouchables are associated with urban pollution.
That's right.
In a dual sense.
That's right.
By virtue of their untouchability, they are polluting to high caste, but they also become associated with poisoning in the sense of pollution, because they're associated with tanneries in urban environments, which are a cause of pollution. They and other low caste groups are held to be responsible for defecating in inappropriate places, polluting water supplies, and a lot of the argument about pollution in that modern industrial urban sense is actually reflecting upon existing caste attitudes to low caste and untouchable groups. So it is quite a complicated story as to how one tries to unpick that kind of overlapping between poison and pollution, and between a ritual and a chemical understanding of what pollution is.
And I guess
that would be part of my wider story. But you're quite right, it is quite difficult to separate out exactly what it is that's being transgressed or what is being poisoned in the situation.
And what is poison connecting in that sense.
Yeah.
And so what is, and that's what I was saying.
Yeah. But it's also interesting to me the means by which the poison is delivered. That in a sense, within the household, food and drink is something which, passes between wife and husband readily. It's not something which is polluting. But in the situations which I'm talking about, in the road situation, why are these people believing, a fake sadhu or a fellow traveller and taking food from somebody who, in many cases, quite obviously is not of a higher caste? Why are they willing to suspend those kinds of taboos and to accept food and drink in that kind of situation?
I think following on from what you said, the story which you told us right in the beginning about the wife who comes back from Puri with a lover.
Yeah.
I mean, the fact that it was Puri would suggest almost certainly that it was a Vaishnav relationship. And Vaishnavs within quite orthodox Hindu norms don't observe the same sort of caste barriers, which would be how an upper caste woman would be able to form a sort of intimate association with a lower caste man. So that's a sort of transgression that was accepted, I think, within a certain kind of Bengali tradition.
Yes,
Demotic tradition.
Yeah, but only up to a point, because the husband is being ostracized by other Brahmins who clearly see this as an inappropriate
transgression. It was sort of opposed to a Brahminical order.
Yeah.
And the other thing that I noticed was that you said the sadhus and fakirs who practiced thuggy were regarded as fake fakirs. Now that's interesting, because I was wondering to what extent poisoning was associated with ritual practices within Hinduism and the use of drugs, for example. This was something that was talked about in the 19th century as being part of the depravity of religious custom. So the fact that this sort of criminality is seen as not really being religious, although they did actually have rituals associated with
Well, again, that's where this story becomes complicated, because the only real evidence I have of these kinds of incidents are coming from police sources, occasionally from trials, occasionally from the forensic evidence produced by the chemical examiner and so on. So one doesn't really know what the actual situation is about. They are stories mediated by another kind of discourse. But certainly, as you say, there is a whole attempt in the course of the 19th century to throw together the nature of popular Hinduism with criminal practices of various kinds. So it is part of the contempt built into those colonial sources to say, of course, this is somebody pretending to be a sadhu or a fakir, as if there were a genuine notion of the sadhu out there which is being undermined by these devious practices. So the whole idea of the sadhu as a stereotype incorporates this notion of implicit deception, criminality, and so on. These people are anyway using drugs, purveying drugs to ether and so on. So there's a conflation between the sadhu, the digital medical practitioner, a whole slew of people who are associated with this. So much so that sadhus become almost a criminal class in the minds of the British, particularly itinerant sadhus in the course of this period. And there are various cases, particularly into the 1910s, 1920s, where these kinds of cases are systematically investigated. Sadhus are exposed, it's not being real sadhus. They're people who are simply doing this for the money. In fact, as I try to hint in passing, a lot of these cases around what I would describe as fertility drugs are much more complicated than that, because it's very clear that many women in particular are going to holy men of whatever description in order to become fertile. And the drugs that are employed in that process involve things like datura and various other things. So in a sense, they're not treating these people as fake sadhus. They believe in the real possibility of these holy men providing them with some cure for their infertility. But in the colonial discourse, this is read as a criminal practice.
Thanks. I think this is a point of entry into lots of very rich areas. And so I guess I had two thoughts or questions. One is about the control of poison and poisonous substances. And I guess the imaginative potency of poison is that it's invisible. There's this kind of stealthy aspect to it. So in a way, you can see why the fears about Tagi might kind of then transfer themselves to poison, because the point about Tagi was a stealthy, crept up on you silently.
Yeah.
And that's the kind of menace of poison. You don't know where and how it's going to come up on you.
Yeah.
And nor do you know how long, when the act might actually happen, because the substance may be a long, slow poison. Indeed, that's the whole relationship to union carbide and Bhopal now.
Yep.
Is it still a kind of poisonous fact there? So I mean, you could sort of see why a colonial state might not be interested in controlling this too tightly, because it maintains a level of threat or menace in everyday life, which can be something that you can use to sort of control the subject population in another way. So that's just one kind of thought or sort of open-ended set of remarks. And then the other is about the use of poison for political assassinations. And of course there's a rich history of this in India and the world there and so on. But it doesn't seem to have been used so much in the, I don't know, this is a question. Was this sort of used at all in the colonial? But I think, thinking of much later, for example, the death of Shastri in Tashkent, which was surrounded by all sorts of rumors about how, and one can think of other examples as well. But in the colonial period, is it something that tends to be used against colonial administrators or political figures or for political purposes?
Well, on the second of those points, I suppose part of its political utility for the British is precisely that it's the kind of Indian princely thing. That's what Indians do to themselves. And as I say, there are only certain kinds of cases, like the fair Baroda one that I was referring to, in which that appears to be a direct threat to European political personnel. So it's almost the exceptionality of that case which makes it seem particularly concerning to the British. I'm not aware that poisoning was ever used, for example, as a technique by the terrorists in India, for whom public assassination, I think, was much more important. You know, that you should actually be there shooting somebody to show your contempt for them, to show your public defiance. It's almost a counter discourse to this narrative of, you know, devious poisoning. And of course, poisoning is often seen as a feminine thing. It's the kind of thing that women supposedly do to men. And many of these stories in India, and indeed universally, represent poisoning as a woman's act. So one might almost argue, I suppose, that it's part of the masculinity of Indian nationalism, particularly of the terrorist movement, that it would eschew precisely those kinds of feminine ploys. So I think that's, you know, to be thought about. So I have no evidence that poisoning was actually used in political assassinations in India. However, there was, if you like, an implicit course of reasoning that India was poison to Europeans. And the case of cholera is a case in point, that lots of Europeans claimed that it was difficult to tell the difference between dying of cholera and dying of arsenic poisoning. And this story is repeated over and over again, including in the background to that legislation in 1904. So the implicit argument is we poor Europeans in India are being poisoned all the time. And that sinister Indians are out there, even though we don't know it, taking advantage of a cholera epidemic to poison us and perhaps themselves. So it's not, if you like, a discourse about open assassination. It's a discourse about the poisonous environment in which Europeans find themselves in India. Whether that's immediately life-threatening or debilitating is another kind of question. But as to your first observation about, you know, the covert nature of poisoning, yes, of course, this is one of the things which gives it part of its terror. Who is to know exactly when poisoning is going to strike? Who knows who's going to be the agency of that poisoning? And that's partly why this whole involvement of servants is particularly interesting. At what point do you become suspicious of your servants? At what point do you begin to think that they might be the route by which your guava meringue is going to be poisoned in this way? That's partly why, as you say, there is this sort of elision with thuggy. It's something which is very difficult to predict, something which is very difficult to act against in anticipation. So yeah, it's part of that whole discursive threat which poison implies. What I find interesting again, though, is the extent to which this poison narrative kind of fades out in the 1920s, 1930s and 1940s. I could be wrong about that, but there seem to be very few actual poison cases which attract public attention in that period. It seems to come back in the period after independence, for reasons which I can't begin to, you know, account for. It's partly, I suppose, because the discourse of poisoning does become much more closely associated with pollution, with urban and industrial pollution in the 1950s and 60s and, of course, in the 70s and 80s. So maybe that's why it acquires a new sort of prominence. But it does seem to, you know, come in phases. It's not a consistent discourse throughout this period.
I guess there's an early dimension of poisoning in, well, it's the earliest stage of that case of the Kumara Babu that Father Chatterjee writes, that it's suspected that he's been poisoned by the doctor.
Just to pursue that point a bit, I mean, one of the things that, you know, that reference to Bhopal, of course, makes me think about whether there are early cases of, you know, spills from industrial waste, chemical factories, etc. It's very difficult to find that kind of pollution, poison narrative in the colonial period. It occurs in connection with water pollution and smoke pollution. It's also buried, it's not very conspicuous, in relation to small-scale industrial activities. You know, Indians who are recycling things, Indians who are making things in small workshops, small-scale factories in which the atmosphere is described as being laden with dust and poison and so on. So that there is an earlier narrative of that kind, but it's quite difficult to prize it out of the sources.
Catherine.
I was wondering, you mentioned chemical analysis a few times in your paper, and I was just wondering what kind of authority that has in this period to pronounce on cases of poisoning. Who's doing that, and whether there are things that are undetectable, and whether that authority is contested.
Well, certainly it was contested in the British cases, I'm sure you know that many of these trials in Britain in the 19th century partly revolved around the question of whether you could actually prove somebody had been poisoned or whether it was accidental and so on. It does have a particular history in this Indian context. Beginning with Bengal in the 1840s, all of the provincial governments in India acquire the services of somebody called a chemical analyst or chemical examiner. Initially, I'm not sure they do a great deal of analysis, but they seem to be able to detect arsenic. They have much more difficulty with datura because the evidence of datura, particularly the seeds of datura, are very difficult to distinguish from the seeds of the common capsicum. So a lot of discussion about whether the seeds found in somebody's intestines actually are the seeds of datura or something else. They claim to be fairly sure about the evidence of arsenic. The problem in the Indian case is often that bodies are burnt, cremated very soon after death, or that they decompose very quickly in the Indian climate, or that they're chewed by tigers before any analysis can take place. So it's the actual availability of that evidence rather than the chemical composition of the evidence, which is often the source of discussion. Do you have enough of a person's body to say it's actually a person who's been killed in this way? The chemical analysis becomes increasingly sophisticated in the late 19th, early 20th century. And the chemical examiner, I would argue, becomes an extremely important example of the way in which the colonial state is beginning to deploy science and technology as an aid to its own instrumentality. And the chemical examiner examines not just human viscera, but also the remains of cattle who've been poisoned. He is also responsible for looking at ammunition to see whether it's genuine, at bottled water to see whether it's been poisoned in some way or another, at ghee. There's a discussion about whether ghee is pure or impure. A whole range of different kinds of substances are being investigated by the chemical examiner. And of course there is a parallel process of bacteriological examination, which is taking place particularly in relation to water and other drinks by the 1910s and 1920s. So it does become a highly sophisticated aspect of state science by the late 19th, early 20th centuries. And at first the chemical examiner is not able to actually present the evidence in court. It's all done second-hand. And indeed, in that early period in the 1840s, they even send body parts from Punjab to Calcutta through the post or by rail in order for the chemical examiner in Calcutta to examine that and then send reports back to Punjab. So no wonder the evidence is a bit tainted by the time it gets back. But the point of this is really that by the late 19th century or 20th century, the chemical examiner is actually called to court and interrogated. What evidence do you have this person was poisoned by arsenic? So their job becomes an increasingly complicated one in the course of the late 19th and 20th centuries.
Yeah, you raised a larger kind of question about intimacy and history.
Yeah.
So I was trying to understand, what is your notion of intimacy in all of this?
Yeah.
I mean, the reason I asked this question is because, I've been struggling with the the question of narrative in history and literature. So I was thinking, can the historian only approach intimacy in terms of an artifact? Or to put it another way, how intimate can a historian get with intimacy?
Well, my point was partly a negative one, that I don't think historians of British India have done much with the problem of intimacy, that intimacy is almost always treated at one or two removes. And indeed, I think it's Ashish Nandi who, in one of his reviews of Kenneth Moore Hatchett's book. Moore Hatchett's book is about race, sex and class under the Raj, about prostitution amongst soldiers and so on. Actually, now he makes the point that this is, a very detached understanding of intimacy. It's intimacy mediated through legislation, through cantonment regulations, through a lock hospital and so on. And it seems to me that many people who've written about sex in India haven't actually written about intimacy. And my point was to read intimacy, as you say, partly about substances, what moves between people of different castes, communities, gender, etc. And poison is one of the things that does, through food and drink and so on. But also the way in which there are certain kind of physical intimacies between people, whether they're sexual, whether they're intimacies of companionship, which poison as a substance helps to illuminate. So the companionship of people travelling together on the road, and therefore being subject to thuggee or poisoning, is one kind of intimacy which I think it's quite interesting to explore. So I don't think of intimacy as just being a substance. I don't think of it as just being sexual, but I think of it as something which is sometimes revealing of a domestic situation. And I think that quite a lot of what's been written about domesticity in India doesn't actually tell you very much about intimacy. It doesn't tell you about the way in which people actually live together. It tells you much more about the construction of that environment, the cultural construction of that environment, not about the way in which individuals actually interact together, the way in which they obey or defy caste norms, how they get on together and so on. So part of my point there was to suggest that we can read beyond that construction of domesticity to a kind of understanding of intimacy which is actually more revealing of that. And it seemed to me that some of the poison cases that I was referring to actually tell us an awful lot, or seem to tell us an awful lot, about the way in which people actually live within households, their estrangements, their passions, what they eat, their material culture, and all of these kinds of things. So my point about intimacy was to try to unpack some of those things. Of course, there are self-proclaimed histories of intimacies. I mean, Theodore Zeldin's book about an intimate history of humanity, I think it's a god-awful book myself, and I think it's a patronising account of a man's view of women's lives. And I think one wants to get away from that to try to understand the varieties of intimacy. And part of my argument about race was that our understanding of race ought to be critiqued in relation to intimacy. And there's this whole idea of race as being, about Europeans and Indians in India being separate and divided worlds in all kinds of ways. And I think that's the kind of rather simplistic analysis that Partha Chatterjee indulges in talking about race as being one of the primary markers of colonial difference. In a sense, I'm trying to suggest it's one of the markers of colonial intimacy, that there are these connections across race. The use of, Indian prostitutes by Eurasians, the use of Indian intermediaries in murders, in poisoning, and so on. And therefore, intimacy is a way of unpacking many of those stereotypical representations of racial difference.
Hallelujah, and then Chris.
Thank you for the interesting talk. And I was, you were also talking about the way in which we use sensational murder cases to kind of uphold certain sorts of narratives and sorts of power equations and status quos that these narratives support. And I was also thinking about the Arushi Talwar murder case, which again has like certain parallels. So I was wondering if you could talk a bit more about the making of the public sphere and how these stories are connected to those sorts of questions.
I'm struggling to see that connection, so you have to...
I mean, the way in which we talk about how, boundaries are transgressed and how poison is a way of doing that. I mean, isn't it also dependent on being able to reflect on who these transgressions will shock?
Well, I suppose that is one of the functions of these kinds of stories, that they have a kind of vicarious appeal, these insights they provide into private lives as opposed to public lives. how far that, either supports or undermines a theory of the public sphere, I'm not sure. I mean, I suppose I've been slightly duplicitous myself in this argument because I've represented it in terms of, intimate histories and state stories. There is, of course, a middle ground, which is actually rather more about the public sphere, and that is the way in which poison narratives become part of a public discourse. And of course, it's not just Europeans who are condemning Indian poisoners. There's a whole emerging discourse amongst middle-class Indians in the late 19th century about the way in which their identities are being subverted by the availability of Indian poisoning. So, for example, some of the pressure for an Indian act on poisoning, in particular against arsenic, comes from Indian medical practitioners and from an Indian middle-class public who are saying, when I go to the bazaar and I buy these things, how do I know they're not poisoned? And that whole debate about ghee and about other items of common consumption is partly an Indian middle-class debate about, are we safe? We're not so concerned about the Britishers, they can die as much as they like, but are we, as an emerging Indian public, being affected by these things? And again, it goes beyond this immediate discussion of poisons. If one talks about pollution, that discourse about pollution is part of the creation of an Indian public sphere, in which there is an articulate middle-class public saying the spaces we occupy are being subject to pollution from factory chimneys, from traffic, all kinds of things. Our lives are being contaminated by the dissemination of smoke, by all these kinds of things. So, yeah, there's a kind of argument about the public sphere emerging there. But as I say, perhaps it's easier in some way to tie that to the question of pollution rather than poison. In a sense, I have the feeling that these poison cases are, as you say, much more about the sensation of the moment and the sensation of the trial, etc. I think it's the pollution discourse which is much more central to that creation of the public sphere.
Chris.
Just wanted to quickly return to the political assassination question because I appreciate the distinction between this public act of the terrorists versus the kind of secrecy of poisoning.
Yeah.
But I wonder if there's a distinction that we can make between the act of poisoning or bomb throwing and the production or control of substances that are part of it. So, there may be a continuity here between the illicit secretive poison maker and the illicit secretive bomb maker, and this might kind of provide this continuity into the 20s and 30s that you were speaking about, because it is things like, there's the explosive substances act, it's the substance that's being controlled, and I wonder if there's any state stories that maybe
I could construct one. I'm not sure it immediately occurs to me. I mean, for example, the chemical examiner I talked about starts off by being somebody largely concerned with these kinds of poison questions, arsenic, datura, etc. By the 1920s, part of the responsibility of the chemical examiner is to look at explosives and to be able to detect the use of explosives in terrorist acts and so on. So you could argue that there is that kind of shift between, if you like, personalised acts of poisoning and the poisoning in a metaphorical sense of the body politic. That the chemical examiner's role is shifting from that more specific responsibility for what is a poison to what is a dangerous substance in the wider context of colonial India. You could argue that, I suppose. But I think it actually belongs to a rather different kind of narrative, and that is the contestation between, to put it crudely, laissez-faire and state intervention. And I think that this is a highly problematic issue, because in many ways one thinks of British India as being a domain of laissez-faire, as far as economic matters are concerned. In fact, what is happening from the 1870s onwards is increasing policing of the environment. The Forest Acts, the acts about wildlife, the acts about water, the Poison Act belongs to that increasing environmental pollution argument. The things are out there which are dangerous to us as Europeans, but to the community at large. And I think, if you like, It's that enlarged notion of state responsibility, or the need for the state to protect itself and those who are subject to it from these outside influences was really important. So I've been trying to tie it to that evolving narrative of policing the environment, policing things which are dangerous or unwelcome, rather than the specific way in which you were representing.
One last question from us.
I come into this as neither as a historian nor as an anthropologist, but just very curious about a comment made in one of the answers about the whole idea of race relationships being a little more complex than has been represented. Firstly, I'd like to talk, if you could explain a bit, what is it that you disagree with the way Arthur Chapman used? So recently another book has come out on colonial Britain.
You mean the black hole?
Yes.
Book, yeah.
So what conceptually, where do you stand against? And secondly, and this is the curious bit, which is when I came to London, I was struck about by the amount of Indian or Oriental medicines that are marketed by very highly established pharmaceutical companies. Simultaneously, there are quite a few Chinese medicinal outlets. And what struck me was not their presence, but their absence in India. There is no use of Chinese medicine as an alternative, modern form of cure for certain things. So I do think there's somewhere an element of imperial relationship underpinning these so-called, these supposed medicinal or thoroughly modern relationships. I think there are questions of imperialism embedded in some of the ways even modern pharmaceutical industry has progressed.
Well, the second part of your question is a vast terrain I won't even attempt to pursue. I mean, in a sense, you're quite right that many of these notions of what we now refer to as Indian medicine or Ayurvedic medicine, what we refer to as Chinese medicine, these are to some extent colonial constructs, in the sense that they acquired a collective identity through colonial practices or through colonial discourse. That, in a sense, in many cases, Ayurveda was a whole series of different kinds of practices in parts of India, subject to different kinds of language groups, etc. And it was only, I say only, but perhaps it was particularly colonial discourse and colonial practice which gave Ayurveda a common sense of identity in the 19th century, and which certainly sparked the reformation of Ayurveda as a modern traditional medicine. So, without wanting to go any further into that discussion, I think you're right to some extent that, we understand these things in those kinds of collectivities and in terms of their very authority by their being mediated through a kind of colonial lens. To go back to the first part of your question, I too have read Partha Chatterjee's recent book about the black hole, and actually I've written a review on EPW if you want to pursue this question further. I think he's actually backtracked a long way from his rather crude observation in the Nation Its Fragments, in which he just throws out quite casually, race is the essential, element of difference in a colonial situation. He never seeks for a moment to explain it, to investigate it. We get some reference to the Ilbert Bill and so on. I think the analysis in the Black Hole book is in some ways more subtle, but also more elusive. Part of my point is that race is not one thing. Race is a whole collection of different ideas and practices. In terms of practice, it is often a very physical thing. It describes the kind of physical abuse that Europeans often perpetrate on Indians. That's something which, in a sense, doesn't rely on ideology. It relies on physical contact. But race is also an ideology, particularly influenced by Darwin and other theorists. It's a notion of racial hierarchies. It's an idea of racial essences. It's a biological discourse about how you differentiate between different kinds of groups. In India, it gets mixed up with a discussion about how you differentiate between tribes and castes and so on as well. But race is also a surprisingly malleable commodity, at least in terms of discourse. Because a lot of the discussion of race in India is how you change races, of how you take a race deemed to be uncivilized and make it civilized by getting that race to adopt Western education, Western dress, Western sanitary practices, Western medicine, or whatever the case may be. So there is an argument in a lot of the medical literature and indeed in the environmental literature that I've looked at about the extent to which you can change races. Not to the extent that Indians cease to be Indians or Bengalis cease to be Bengalis, but they become different kinds of people as a result of addressing what are seen to be their racial deficiencies and so on. So I would argue that actually there's much more plasticity about the notion of race than people have realised, both in terms of its very plural meanings, but also in terms of the way in which it was not seen to be a static, fixed, biosocial commodity, but a kind of fluid thing through which change could be brought about, rather than separate identities preserved for all time.
Well, that brings us close to Arnold's work on intimacy and
Yes.
policing of intimacy and production of race.
Yes.
Does that sort of sing better with your...
Well, I was thinking today I ought to go back to Anne Stoller's work because she does indeed try to address questions of intimacy, although in her own way.
Yes.
I would need to go back to the work.
So it produces race as opposed to...
Yeah, and indeed she does engage with Foucault and
Yeah.
how far Foucault is talking about intimacy and race and so on. I think there is some sense in which her work is perhaps closer to those kinds of questions than most people working on the Indian context have actually recognised. I think that's true. Yeah. And of course she's an anthropologist. That's all.
Of course. If there are no further questions, one last, okay, quick question.
It struck me that when we were talking about and sort of the cases that we've discussed of the 19th century, poison itself appears to be an intimate substance.
Yeah.
It can only be given in close proximity. So it illuminates intimacy because it itself is an intimate substance. So how do we juxtapose that with something like the Bhopal gas tragedy, where it is no longer an intimate substance?
Well, it's partly an intimate thing, of course, because it affects people's lives very intimately and directly. I don't know. I think that's a good question, and I would have to think about it. As I say, it's easier to answer that question by talking about pollution and pollution of poison rather than about poison in the rather restricted sense I talked about it today. Because certainly if you look at the discourse about smoke pollution in both Bombay and Calcutta, talk about water contamination, it is about a public, about the way in which something which might be the result of individual activity, defecation, certain kinds of industrial processes, etc., becomes then something which poisons a public. So it's not a complete answer to your question, but that's where I would see the precedent for the Bhopal discussion. I see Bhopal as both profoundly intimate and profoundly public at the same time. I think that's part of the weight of that episode. And sometimes it's a weight, I suppose, which novelists have been better able to capture than historians. I mean, a novel like Animals, People, tries to capture some of the intimacy of poison and pollution in a way which historians, I think, find emotionally and professionally quite difficult to grasp. And I suppose I just wanted in this discussion to try to open up some of those questions in a way which I think historians, at least of India, mostly don't try to do.
No, thank you very much. It's been a privilege to have you here and share your work. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you all for your questions. Well, thank you for coming.
Thank you.
We'll catch up.